The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Chapter 1. Mandie. Don't get so close, Amanda, you might fall in. Her mother grasped the back of her long, dark skirt. Mandie tried to pull free. Her tear-filled blue eyes sought a glimpse of her father through the homemade wooden coffin resting by the open grave. I want to go with you, Daddy, she was mumbling to herself. Take me with you. She tugged at her long blonde braid in grief. Even in her sadness, she was afraid of being scolded by her mother. She dared not cry out in anguish. Her voice trembled as she whispered, How can I live without you, Daddy? You were the only one that ever loved me. I can't bear it alone. Preacher DeHart's deep voice echoed throughout the hills. We all know Jim Shaw was a good man. He drew his last breath talking to God. We trust his soul is at peace. His voice grew louder and more empathetic. But friends and loved ones, I'm here to remind you one thing. When that time comes for you to face your Maker, you will be damned to hellfire and brimstone if you have lived a sinful life. Mandie trembled as she heard the words. You will incur the wrath of God, and your soul will burn forevermore, he continued. Above all, let us remember the 10 Commandments and keep them holy. Live by them and walk by the straight and narrow path, in preparation for the hereafter. Otherwise, I admonish you, your soul will burn in hell. Your soul will be used to feed the fires of the devil. When you have sinned and come short of the glory of God, he will forsake you. You will be punished. The child was so overcome by fear and grief as the final words were said for her father, and the coffin was lowered into the ground. The clods of mountain wood dirt hit the casket with a thud. She gasped for breath, and falling on her knees beside the grave, she appealed to God. What have I done to cause you to take my daddy away, dear God? You know I can't live without my daddy, God. I love him so much, dear God. The crowd standing nearby silently wiped away tears. The earth was smoothed into a mound, and a rough marker was pounded into the soil with an axe. It read, James Alexander Shaw, born April 3rd, 1863. Died April 13th, 1900. Such a small remembrance for such a big-hearted man. Jim Shaw had no enemies. Everyone had been his friend. It was April, but it was still cold in the Nantahala Mountains of North Carolina. Mandie, trembling with cold and emotion, couldn't stop shaking enough to rise from her knees, so her mother grabbed her arm and pulled her up and away from her father's grave. Her legs would hardly carry her. Through her blinding tears, she caught a glimpse of Uncle Ned standing at the edge of the woods. Uncle Ned, the old Cherokee Indian, came often to the Shaws' neighborhood, selling hand-woven baskets. He and Mandie's father had been good friends. He had loved her father, too. She suddenly jerked free from her mother, running to the tall Indian for comfort. Uncle Ned swooped to catch her in his arms, his necklace of shells softly brushed against her face. Uncle Ned, God doesn't love me anymore. He took my daddy away from me, she cried. My papoose, father, good man. Not gone far, only to Happy Hunting Ground. His pronunciation was good, but his grammar was poor. He stroked her blonde hair as she buried her wet face against his deerskin jacket. Amanda, come now. We're going home, right now, the plump woman shouted to the girl. Come, get in the wagon. Uncle Ned, please come see me. I love you. Mandie quickly kissed his red-skinned cheek and turned to obey her mother. The old Indian held her hand. I make promise, your father. I look out for you. I keep promise. He smiled and released her hand. Her heartbeat quickened as she heard his words. There would be someone to watch over her. But Uncle Ned could never overrule her mother. She had always bossed her father around, but then Uncle Ned has his own tribe behind him. He would indeed keep his word to her father. Etta Shaw snatched the girl's hand and slapped her face. Hush up, get in the wagon, this minute. She gave the girl a shove and called instructions to her sister. Mandie's sister, Irene, all but lifted her up as she forced the girl to climb into the waiting wagon, the same one that had brought her father's casket to the ceremony. All the other mourners had already turned down the long hill ahead of them. "Now sit down and shut up." Irene was 2 years older than the 11-year-old Mandie was afraid of her rough ways. She knew she couldn't resist. She gave one last pitiful look at Uncle Ned, who stood witnessing the scene with his keen black eyes, and fixed her gaze ahead. She would go home now, but she would come back as soon as she got the chance. Her eyes stayed on the mound of the earth until they were down the side of the mountain. A row of trees blocked her view. Sitting in the back of the wagon with her sister, Mandie suddenly realized that her mother had not shed a tear. Neither had her sister. She turned to look at her mother. Etta Shaw was busy talking and laughing with Zack as they bumped on down the rough road. "She didn't love my daddy," she was thinking. "She acts like she's glad he's gone. How could she laugh as though she'd already forgotten he ever existed?" Her thoughts turned back to the happy times with her father. He was always laughing, always ready to take her side against any disagreements with her mother and Irene. She could see his smiling face, his red curly hair, his blue eyes twinkling with some little secret between them. He had always been there to comfort his dear Mandie through the trials and tribulations of her 11 years. And then, suddenly, he was gone. God had taken him away. Mandie was beginning to realize the way things really were. She could never remember being loved by her mother. As young as she was, she knew Irene was her mother's favorite. As far back as she could recall, Irene had always been given the new dresses, which were later shortened to fit her, even though the dresses were made with rows of tucks around the skirts that could have been let out as Irene grew. She had never had a brand new dress in her life. The old dark blue frock she was wearing had been made for Irene, and although it was almost threadbare, it had been hemmed yesterday for her to wear to her father's funeral. Mandie tugged at the faded fabric, wishing that she could be rid of the dress. "Why don't they hurry up and get home?" she cried to herself. Her mother and Zack were leisurely riding along, talking too lowly for Mandie to understand what they were saying, with an occasional loud laugh from her mother. Irene kept to herself, busy snatching at the bushes as the wagon brushed past them on the narrow dirt road. At last they got down to Charlie Gap, and their log cabin came into sight. It was huddled in the trees at the bottom of the slope. The hill to the north behind it gave a protection against the cold mountains in the winter. The clearing around the house was already full of wagons and buggies and horses. People were standing around talking under the chestnut trees. Zack drove their wagon straight to the barn. Mandie knew she would never be able to escape her mother that day. She would have to help, wait on all these people who had come to eat and drink as soon as their father had been laid out in the front room on Friday. Today being Sunday, the whole congregation had come after the church service, which had included the last rites for her father. She knew none of them had been home yet to eat, and that meant work for her. She had never been near a death before, and couldn't understand why they all acted like it was a party. Why didn't they go home? Leave me alone, she wondered. I want to be by myself and think. The chickens clucked and scattered as her mother jumped down from the wagon. "Let's get to the kitchen and see about them victuals." She waited to see that Mandie was coming along her. Mandie scooped up her fluffy white kitten, who had come to greet her, and ran toward the house. "See you in a little while, Zack. Gotta get this crowd fed. Better come on and get something to eat yourself," Etta called back. "Long in a minute, Etta." Zack spit tobacco juice as she replied, and began unharnessing Molly. Irene jumped down from the wagon as a tall, gangly boy came up. She put on her best smile and smoothed her skirts as she tossed her dark hair. "Hello, Nimrod," she giggled. "Want to take a walk up to the spring house before Mom puts me to work?" "Sure, Irene," the boy answered eagerly. "Slip off any of the day's work. Let's get a long, cool drink from that spring water." As they hurried off behind the cabin before Etta missed Irene. As Mandie walked through the crowd in the front room, she saw old Mrs. Shulp take a dip of snuff, stick in her sweet gum, toothbrush in her toothless mouth, and then remark, "Poor child, he was all she had. Things is gonna be rough now that Miss Dewis shook her gray head. "No, not as long as that Zachariah Hughes is around." She nodded. Mandie fled through the door into the kitchen, not wanting to hear any more, and above all, not wanting to speak to any of these people. They were mostly her mother's kinfolk and friends. This was her mother's part of the country. Her father had always told her that his people had lived a long way off, but he never said where. The big round oak table was loaded with food and people had brought, but it held no enticement for her nervous stomach. The warmth from the cook stove felt good to her. The heat thawed somewhat. "Mama," she began, unsure of herself, "where did my daddy come from?" Etta Shaw stopped to look at her and set down the plates from the cupboard. "What do you mean, where did he come from?" "Well, you always said he was raised in a city somewhere." "That's right," Etta interrupted. "He was a book-rid. That's all you need to know. Now get those forks and knives out, and the glasses. We'll be needing all of 'em. And run and get that first piece of ham hanging on the side of the smokehouse." Mandie gave a sigh and obeyed.